Impeachment is back, and this time it's not symbolic. 140 members of Congress just went on the record voting to move forward with impeaching Donald Trump. Again, let me repeat that number, 140 lawmakers, that is nearly one-third of the entire House of Representatives saying the sitting president should be put on trial. But here is what makes this different from every other impeachment attempt. These weren't just progressive firebrands. These were moderates, members from swing districts, lawmakers who usually avoid controversy at all costs because they're terrified of losing re-election. They broke ranks anyway, and now the Senate is staring at a very real possibility. Another impeachment trial just as the 2026 campaign season heats up. This is Strategic Signal Report. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and tonight we're breaking down why 140 votes changes the entire calculation, why Al Green's strategy is working, and why Senate Republicans are trapped between two political nightmares. What happened on December 11th? Why are moderates suddenly willing to risk their careers? And what happens if this actually reaches the Senate floor? Stay with me, because what you are about to learn explains why this vote, even though leadership technically blocked it, actually changes everything about what comes next. Let's break it down. December 11th wasn't a quiet procedural moment buried in committee. This was loud, this was public, this was deliberate, Democratic representative. Al Green from Texas forced a vote using a procedural mechanism that left House leadership with absolutely no way to quietly bury the issue. The House had to take a public position. Every member had to go on the record. And when the clerk started calling names, it went like this: guilty, not guilty, guilty, not guilty, name after name, vote after vote. Leadership scrambled. Democratic leaders actually joined Republicans to table the resolution to prevent it from immediately advancing. Technically, yes, they succeeded. The resolution didn't pass that day. But here's what you cannot ignore. 140 members voted to advance it anyway. They broke ranks. They defied leadership. They went on the record saying impeachment should happen now, not later, not after the election. Now, and that number is massive. This wasn't just AOC and the squad rallying a symbolic handful of votes. This was moderates, members from competitive districts, lawmakers who usually avoid anything remotely controversial. They took the risk anyway, and that tells you something critical about the internal pressure building inside the Democratic caucus right now. Let's talk about Al Green for a moment, because he's at the center of all this and he is not backing down. After the vote, Green delivered a floor speech that was explosive. He accused Trump of normalizing political violence, not hinting at it, not flirting with dangerous rhetoric, normalizing it. Green said Trump has created an environment where threatening lawmakers, where suggesting members of Congress could be harmed or killed for their political positions, is becoming acceptable. Then he did something even more dramatic. He announced what he called a countdown to impeachment. He promised to file additional articles before the Christmas break. His reasoning was blunt. Congress cannot allow a president to make violence against lawmakers feel justified. That's not rhetorical flourish. That's a sitting member of Congress accusing the president of actively endangering the legislative branch. And again, 140 members agreed with him enough to vote for impeachment. Now, this vote didn't come out of nowhere. Al Green has been pushing toward this moment since earlier this year. This is his third attempt. The first time, he focused on abuse of presidential power, arguing Trump was using the office to punish political enemies and weaken institutions designed to check executive authority. That attempt barely made a ripple. Democratic leadership wasn't interested. Too many remembered Trump's first impeachment and how it failed while energizing his base. Then came the second attempt. This time, Green focused on foreign policy, accusing Trump of making unilateral military commitments without congressional approval, essentially usurping Congress's constitutional power to declare war. The argument was constitutionally serious, but again, it didn't gain traction. But something changed over the summer and fall. Trump's rhetoric escalated, not subtly, dramatically. He started openly talking about jailing political opponents. He framed lawmakers who opposed him as enemies, traitors, threats to the nation, and the language started carrying an unmistakable undertone. These people deserve punishment. Here's where this gets darker, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Capitol Police documented a surge in threats against members of Congress. Not just angry emails or social media rants, credible threats that required increased security. Some lawmakers needed protective details. Offices were warned. Families were warned, and these threats consistently followed Trump speeches, Trump posts, Trump statements where he described political opponents in language historically associated with violence. That's when Green shifted his entire strategy. Political violence became the centerpiece of his impeachment case in a series of floor Speeches in late November and early December, Green laid out what experts call stochastic terrorism. It's a term that sounds academic, but the concept is straightforward. A leader doesn't have to directly order violence. They just have to use language that makes violence feel justified to supporters who are already primed to act. Trump doesn't have to say go hurt them. He just has to call them traitors. He just has to imply punishment is deserved. His supporters fill in the rest, and we've already seen what that looks like. We lived through January 6th. We've watched threats escalate. We've seen lawmakers from both parties face intimidation. Greeny's argument is that a president cannot be allowed to attack a co-equal branch of government by creating an environment where members fear physical harm for doing their jobs. That's not politics as usual. That's an assault on democratic governance itself. So when December 11th arrived, Green used his procedural tool to force the vote. Leadership tried to shut it down. They argued it was too risky, too divisive, too premature. But 140 members said no, and that number changed everything because this wasn't just the progressive wing anymore. Moderates voted for it. Members from swing districts voted for it. The internal calculation inside the party has shifted. The base is furious. Voters are demanding accountability, and more lawmakers are deciding that doing nothing is actually more dangerous than acting. Now the question becomes, what happens next? Because if this support keeps growing, if a few more members flip, if another scandal breaks, if Trump's rhetoric escalates again, the House could actually pass articles of impeachment. And if that happens, the Senate doesn't get to pretend this isn't real anymore. They're forced to act. And that's where the real political nightmare begins. Because once the House passes articles of impeachment, the Constitution is clear. The Senate must respond. They must hold a trial. They can't ignore it. They can't delay indefinitely, and that creates an impossible situation for Senate Republicans, if they hold a real trial one. With witnesses, testimony, and evidence, it completely hijacks the national conversation for weeks, possibly months. Trump's agenda freezes, everything else stops, every headline becomes impeachment, every Republican senator is forced to take a position on the record, and every ugly detail of Trump's rhetoric and its consequences gets dragged into public view. That's the nightmare scenario for Republicans. But the alternative isn't any better. If the Senate rushes through a shallow, pro forma trial and votes to acquit without seriously engaging the evidence, they look like they're covering for Trump. They look like they're putting party loyalty above democratic norms, and that's exactly the narrative Democrats want heading into 2026. So Senate Republicans are trapped between two terrible options, and you can already see the panic starting to show. Some senators are quietly hoping the House never gets the votes so they don't have to deal with it at all. Others are dusting off their talking points about partisan witch hunts, and a few, very quietly, are asking themselves whether this might finally be the moment they can break with Trump without being destroyed by his base. Because here's the reality. Most Republican senators don't want to defend Trump's behavior privately. Many are exhausted by it, but they're terrified of what happens if they cross him. We already saw the consequences during Trump's second impeachment. 7 Republican senators voted to convict, and nearly all of them paid a heavy political price. Some retired rather than face Trump-backed primary challengers. Others became targets of relentless harassment. That lesson landed hard. Don't cross Trump. It's not worth it. But politics isn't static. The 2026 midterms are approaching. And senators care about re-election above everything else. If public opinion starts to shift, if independents begin viewing Trump as a genuine threat rather than just a controversial figure, the calculation changes. Suddenly, protecting Trump could cost seats. That's the gamble Democrats are making. They are betting that impeachment hearings focused on political violence and threats against lawmakers will resonate with voters tired of chaos. They're betting that forcing Republicans to vote on the record will expose fractures inside the party, and they're betting that enough voters will see this not as partisan revenge, but as accountability. And this impeachment push isn't happening in isolation. It's unfolding at the exact same time as multiple other scandals, allegations around the Epstein files, accusations of corruption. Claims the Justice Department is stonewalling investigations. Each story alone might not move the needle, but together they create a pattern of an administration that believes it's untouchable. And that's the narrative Democrats are building. Trump and his inner circle are corrupt. They're above the law. They're willing to bend or break norms to protect themselves, and Congress has a duty to intervene. Al Green has been explicit about this. He's framed impeachment not as a single act, but as part of a broader fight over accountability. He's arguing that if Congress fails to act now, it sends a message that future presidents can do the same or worse without consequences. And that argument is gaining traction, because avoiding controversy hasn't stabilized anything. Trump hasn't moderated, the threats haven't slowed, the scandals haven't stopped, doing nothing hasn't lowered the temperature. If anything, it's allowed things to escalate. So now the collision course is set. Green is promising more articles. Support inside the House is growing. The Senate is bracing for impact. And Trump, true to form, is doubling down on the very rhetoric that put him in this position in the first place. The next few weeks matter a lot, because one more major incident, one more explosive statement, one more credible threat tied back to Trump's words that could be enough to tip the balance. And if that happens, the House moves. And once the House moves, all hell breaks loose. This isn't just about Donald Trump. It's about whether Congress still functions as a real check on presidential power. That's what impeachment was designed for. The founders didn't create it as a symbolic gesture. They created it as an emergency brake, something Congress could pull when a president threatened the constitutional order. And that eased the question Al Green is forcing lawmakers to confront. Does Congress still have that courage? Or has the presidency grown so powerful, so insulated by party loyalty, that nothing can stop it anymore? Trump has tested the limits of executive power in ways few presidents ever have. He's pushed norms, he's ignored traditions, he's attacked institutions that were once untouchable. And time after time, he's survived because Republicans closed ranks and Democrats hesitated. Green's argument is simple but unsettling. If Congress refuses to act now, if it allows a president to normalize threats against lawmakers, to encourage hostility toward a co-equal branch of government, then it's effectively surrendering its own authority. And once that authority is gone, it doesn't come back easily. And this is why the political violence angle is so critical. This isn't an abstract disagreement over policy. This isn't about tax rates or foreign aid. This is about whether it's acceptable for a president to create an atmosphere where elected officials fear for their lives. Green believes Trump has crossed that line, and the evidence isn't hypothetical. Capitol Police have documented a dramatic increase in threats. Offices have been evacuated. Security has been upgraded. Families have been warned. This is the real-world consequence of rhetoric that frames opponents as enemies, as traitors, as people who deserve punishment. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. Republicans have been targeted too. Lawmakers who criticize Trump have received death threats. Some required security details. Others changed their routines entirely. But most Republicans refuse to acknowledge the connection. They downplay it. They describe threats as isolated incidents, and that argument collapses under scrutiny when the most powerful person in the country repeatedly uses language that dehumanizes opponents and suggests they deserve consequences. It shapes behavior. Trump knows that. He's not careless with his words. He's strategic. That's why Green calls this impeachable, because a president cannot undermine the safety of lawmakers and still claim to be governing democratically. And this brings us back to the Senate. If impeachment reaches them, they're not just voting on Trump, they're voting on whether this conduct is acceptable, and every senator knows that, especially those in swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, places where elections are won and lost on thin margins. For those senators, there's no safe vote. Convict Trump, and they risk their careers at the hands of his base. Acquit him, and they risk alienating independents exhausted by chaos. That's the trap. And it's why so many Republicans are quietly furious that this issue won't go away. Because impeachment forces clarity. It removes the ability to dodge, to issue vague statements, to pretend neutrality. It demands a yes or no, guilty or not guilty. And that kind of clarity is politically dangerous. Here's where we are. 140 members have already broken ranks. The momentum is building. The Senate is preparing for something it desperately doesn't want to face. And Al Green isn't stopping. He's promised more articles. He's made this personal. He's framed it as a fight, not just over Trump, but over the future of congressional authority itself. The question now isn't whether impeachment will be attempted again. The question is whether it succeeds, and that answer may come sooner than anyone expected. Because if a few more members flip, if Trump's rhetoric escalates again, if one more major incident ties back to his words, the House could actually pass articles. And if the House passes articles, the Senate has no choice. The Constitution forces them to act. They can't hide, they can't delay, they can't pretend this isn't happening. Every Republican senator will be forced to make a choice that defines their political future. Defend Trump and risk losing independence, or convict Trump and risk being destroyed by his base. There is no safe middle ground, and Democrats know it. That's why they're pushing this now, because the political pain for Republicans grows with every passing day. The closer we get to 2026, the more dangerous this vote becomes for vulnerable senators. And if Democrats can force that vote during campaign season, it becomes a referendum on Trump himself in races where Republicans can't afford to lose a single percentage point. Tonight, we've broken down why 140 votes changes everything. This wasn't symbolic protest. This was moderates from swing districts defying leadership. And going on the record for impeachment, Al Green's strategy is working. The political violence argument is gaining traction, and Senate Republicans are trapped between two nightmare scenarios with no safe escape. The next few weeks will determine whether this momentum continues or whether leadership can hold the line. But one thing is clear, the pressure is building, the base is furious, and doing nothing is becoming more politically dangerous than acting. This is the kind of institutional analysis you get every day at Strategic Signal Report. We don't just report the vote count, we explain the power mechanics driving it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for daily briefings on the forces reshaping American politics. We post at AM and PM Est. Comment below, will the House actually pass impeachment articles? Or will leadership find a way to stop this momentum? Your analysis matters. For Strategic Signal Report, I'm Sarah Mitchell. We'll continue tracking this collision course as it unfolds. Stay informed, stay analytical, and we'll see you in the next briefing.